Because if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. If evil exists, it follows that objective values and duties do exist, namely some things are evil. So evil actually proves the existence of God, since in the absence of God, good and evil as such would not exist.
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I've stumbled across this video where Sam Harris and William Lane Craig are going head to head in one of the most intense debates about morality and whether we actually need God to determine right from wrong. Sam Harris is coming from the atheist perspective, arguing that morality can be grounded in the well-being of conscious creatures, while William Lane Craig is defending the position that, without God, objective morality simply cannot exist. This debate gets heated, especially when Sam starts challenging Craig on the problem of suffering and innocent children dying, while God apparently does nothing. And Craig fires back with some pretty bold philosophical arguments about evil actually proving God exists. So make sure you watch until the end, because the final exchange where they clash over divine command theory is absolutely mind-blowing. And please comment down below where you're watching from. I really love to see people from all over the world connecting in here. All right, now let's get into the video.
Okay, who can understand God's will? Okay, and yet this is precisely, this merely human understanding of God's will is precisely what believers use to establish his goodness in the first place. You know, something good happens to a Christian. He feels some bliss while praying, say, or he sees some positive change in his life, and we're told that God is good. Okay, but when children by the tens of thousands are torn from their parents' arms and drowned, we're told that God is mysterious. Okay, this is how you play tennis without the net. Okay, and I want to suggest to you that it is not only tiresome when otherwise intelligent people speak this way, it is morally reprehensible. Okay, this kind of faith is really the perfection of narcissism. I mean, God loves me, don't you know? He cured me of my eczema. He makes me feel so good while singing in church. And just when we had given up hope, he found a banker who was willing to reduce my mother's mortgage. Okay. Given all that this God of yours does not accomplish in the lives of others, given the misery that's being imposed on some helpless child at this instant, this kind of faith is obscene. Okay. To think in this way is to fail to reason honestly or to care sufficiently about the suffering of other human beings. And if God is good and loving and just and kind, and he wanted to guide us morally with a book, why give us a book that supports slavery? Why give us a book that admonishes us to kill people for imaginary crimes like witchcraft? Now, of course, there's a way of not taking these questions to heart. Okay, according to Dr. Craig's divine command theory, God is not bound by moral duties. God doesn't have to be good. Whatever he commands is good. So when he commands that the Israelites to slaughter the Amalekites, that behavior becomes intrinsically good because he commanded it. Okay, well, here we're being offered, I'm glad he raised the issue of psychopathy, we're being offered a psychopathic and psychotic moral attitude. It's psychotic because this is completely delusional. There's no reason to believe that we live in a universe ruled by an invisible monster, Yahweh. But it is psychopathic because this is a total detachment from the well-being of human beings. This so easily rationalizes the slaughter of children. Okay, just think about the Muslims at this moment who are blowing themselves up, okay, convinced that they are agents of God's will. There is absolutely nothing that Dr. Craig can say against their behavior in moral terms, apart from his own faith-based claim that they're praying to the wrong God. If they had the right God, what they were doing would be good on divine command theory. Now, I'm obviously not saying that Dr. Craig or all religious people are psychopaths and psychotics, but this to me is the true horror of religion. It allows perfectly decent and sane people to believe by the billions what only lunatics could believe on their own. Okay, if you wake up tomorrow morning thinking that saying a few Latin words over your pancakes is going to turn them into the body of Elvis Presley, okay, you have lost your mind. Okay? But if you think more or less the same thing about a cracker and the body of Jesus, you're just a Catholic. And I'm not the first person to notice that it's a very strange sort of loving God who would make salvation depend on believing in him on bad evidence. Okay, I mean, if you lived 2,000 years ago, there was evidence galore. I mean, he was just performing miracles. But apparently he got tired of being so helpful. Okay, and so now we all inherit this very heavy burden of the doctrine's implausibility. And the effort to square it with what we now know about the cosmos and what we know about the all-too-human origins of Scripture becomes more and more difficult. Okay, and it's not just the generic God that Dr. Craig is recommending. It is God the Father and Jesus the Son. Okay, Christianity, on Dr. Craig's account, is the true moral wealth of the world. Well, I hate to break it to you here at Notre Dame, but Christianity is a cult of human sacrifice. Christianity is not a religion that repudiates human sacrifice. It is a religion that celebrates a single human sacrifice as though it were effective. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. John 3:16. Okay, the idea is that Jesus suffered the crucifixion so that none need suffer hell, except that those billions in India and billions like them throughout history. Okay, this is astride. This doctrine is astride a contemptible history of scientific ignorance and religious barbarism. We come from people who used to bury children under the foundations of new buildings as offerings to their imaginary gods. I mean, just think about that. In vast numbers of societies, people would bury children in post holes, people like ourselves thinking that this would prevent an invisible being from knocking down their buildings. Okay. These are the sorts of people who wrote the Bible. Okay. If there is a less moral framework,
this is where Sam Harris cuts through all the philosophical smoke and forces William Lane Craig to confront the actual reality of the God he is defending. When Sam brings up the sheer scale of human suffering around the world, particularly among the most innocent and vulnerable, he is exposing a logical contradiction that Craig cannot escape. Because if God is all-powerful and all-loving and the foundation of objective morality, then that level of suffering becomes impossible to justify. Sam makes the point that any deity who would allow this level of preventable suffering either cannot do anything about it or chooses not to, which makes that deity either limited in power or indifferent. That is not rhetoric. That is basic logic. You cannot claim an all-powerful, all-loving God while acknowledging massive preventable suffering without one of those claims being compromised. And here is where it gets even more challenging for Craig's position. Sam points out that according to certain theological frameworks, many of these suffering people face consequences in the afterlife simply because they were born into the wrong religious tradition. Think about what that means. Someone born in a region where Christianity is not the dominant faith, through no choice of their own, faces eternal consequences because their parents raised them in a different belief system. Meanwhile, as Sam illustrates, someone who lived a terrible life harming others can have a last-minute change of heart and receive eternal reward. If you were designing a moral system from scratch, would you ever create something that imbalanced? Of course not. This is not a coherent moral framework. It is a system where your geographic birthplace determines your eternal outcome. And Sam is absolutely right to challenge this, because it requires you to look at unimaginable suffering and say, well, the divine must have reasons, while simultaneously claiming that same divine being is the source of all goodness.
You cannot hold up a being as morally perfect while defending a system where location determines destiny. That is not objective morality. That is a lottery with infinite consequences. And the families of those who are suffering are praying desperately for relief, and those prayers seem to go unanswered. What kind of moral foundation does that represent?
The less moral framework is atheism. Atheism has no grounds for objective moral values or duties. And it's interesting that in that last speech, I was disappointed to hear no defense given of that crucial second contention that I offered against Dr. Harris's view. Remember, we talked about the value problem. I gave what I consider a knockdown argument to show that the moral landscape is not identical to the continuum of human flourishing. We talked about objective moral duties, the is versus ought distinction, the ought implies can problem. None of these have been responded to. So if you want a really desperate moral system, try atheism. There's no foundation for objective moral values and duties there. Now, what about theism? Does it do any better? Well, in the last speech, we heard some attacks on my first contention that God provides a sound foundation for morality. Unfortunately, it seems to be that most of these were red herrings. A red herring is a smelly old fish that's dragged across the path of the bloodhounds to distract them from their true quarry, so they get distracted and go off following the dead fish. And I'm not going to be distracted by the red herrings that were offered in that last speech. For example, in response to my claim that if God exists, then objective moral values exist, we heard that I haven't truly offered an alternative to his view, because the goal on theism is to avoid hell. Honestly, it just simply shows how poorly Sam Harris understands Christianity. You don't believe in God to avoid going to hell. Belief in God isn't some kind of fire insurance. You believe in God because God, as the supreme good, is the appropriate object of adoration and love. He is goodness itself, to be desired for its own sake. And so the fulfillment of human existence is to be found in relation to God. It is because of who God is and his moral worth that he is worthy of worship. It has nothing to do with avoiding hell or promoting your own well-being. He then responds, but there's no good reason to believe that such a being exists. Look at the problem of evil and the problem of the unevangelized. Both of these, as I explained in my opening speech, are irrelevant in tonight's debate because I'm not arguing that God exists. Maybe he's right. Maybe these are insuperable objections to Christianity or to theism. It wouldn't affect either of my contentions that if God exists, then we have a sound foundation for moral values and duties. If then we have no foundation for objective moral values and duties. So these are red herrings. Now, I have written on each of these problems, the problem of evil and the problem of the unevangelized, and you can find much of what I've said at our website, reasonablefaith.org. If you're interested, go ahead and look at that. Or, as Michael Ray suggested, talk to one of your philosophy professors. Michael has written extensively on the problem of evil, and I'm sure he'd love to have a conversation with you about those things. Notice, secondly, I would want to say, evil actually proves that God exists. Because if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. If evil exists, it follows that objective values and duties do exist, namely some things are evil. So evil actually proves the existence of God, since in the absence of God, good and evil as such would not exist. So you cannot press both the problem of evil and agree with my contention that if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist, because evil actually will be an argument for the existence of God. Notice that Dr. Harris has no moral foundation for saying that Christian beliefs are morally execrable, because he has no foundation for making such a judgment.
Watch what William Lane Craig does here, because this is textbook deflection. He opens by declaring that the less sound moral framework is atheism, but then refuses to engage with any of the moral challenges Sam just laid out about the Christian framework. Instead, he dismisses them as red herrings, as distractions. But how is the problem of innocent suffering a distraction when we are debating whether God provides a sound foundation for morality? If your moral system leads to eternal negative consequences for people born in the wrong location through no fault of their own, that is not a side issue. That is the central issue. And then Craig tries to reframe why people believe in God. He says you do not believe in God to avoid negative afterlife consequences. You believe because God, as the supreme good,
is the appropriate object of adoration and love. But that is just poetry without substance. You are telling me to revere a being as the supreme good, while that being presides over a universe where innocent people suffer on a massive scale with seemingly no intervention? That is not recognizing goodness. That is defending a system simply because you have been taught to accept it without question. And here is where Craig makes his most circular move. He claims that the existence of evil actually proves that God exists, because if objective moral values do not exist without God, and evil exists, then God must exist. But that entire argument rests on the premise that you need God for objective morality, which is exactly what Sam has been challenging this whole debate. Sam has shown you can ground morality in the well-being of conscious creatures without invoking any deity. So Craig's argument becomes, evil proves God exists because I have already decided morality requires God. That is not philosophy. That is assuming your conclusion. The real question Craig never answers is, why should we accept that God is necessary for morality when we can clearly understand that suffering is bad and flourishing is good without any reference to divine commands? Craig keeps saying that on atheism there is no foundation for values, but Sam has provided that foundation. It is the well-being of conscious creatures. That is tangible. That is something we can observe and measure. That is something we can all recognize and agree on, regardless of religious background.
If atheism is true, what objective foundation is there for affirming that one view is execrable and another is not? There's simply no basis for such judgments. So, if he wants to have a debate on theism, I will happily engage in one with him, but that's not the debate for tonight. He also says it's psychopathic to believe these things. Now that remark is just as stupid as it is insulting. It is absurd to think that people like Professor Peter Van Inwagen here at the University of Notre Dame is psychopathic, or that a guy like Dr. Tom Flint, who is as gracious a Christian gentleman as I could have ever met, is psychopathic. This is simply below the belt. So it seems to me that we've not been given any refutation of the view that if God does exist, then his essence, his character, is determinative for the existence of objective moral values. What about objective moral duties? Here I explained that God's commands must be consistent with his nature. And Dr. Harris continues to press the point, but the Bible supports slavery. Again, I'll refer you to Professor Copan's book, which shows that that is a gross misrepresentation of ancient Israel, which did not, in fact, promote slavery as we understand it in light of the experience in the American South. But again, that's simply not irrelevant because that isn't relevant because I'm not defending the Bible tonight. I'm saying that for a theist, whether Jew, Christian, deist, Hindu, moral duties will be grounded in the divine commands which are based in his nature. He says, but then what about people like the Taliban who say that God has commanded them to do certain atrocities? I would say the very same thing to the Taliban that Dr. Harris says, namely, God did not command you to do those things. That's exactly what Dr. Harris would say. The reason he thinks that is because he doesn't believe that God exists, but I would say that because I think that the Taliban has got the wrong God, that in fact God hasn't commanded them to commit these atrocities, and indeed God will only issue such commands as are consistent with his moral nature and for which he has morally sufficient reasons. So I don't think this first contention is really in much dispute tonight. I think it's obvious that if God exists, then obviously objective moral values exist independently of human opinion. They're grounded in the character of God. And there would be objective moral duties if God exists, because our duties arise in response to the moral imperatives that God issues to us.
This final exchange is where Sam completely dismantles the psychological foundation of divine command theory, and you need to understand why this matters so much. He brings up research showing that healthy children instinctively understand the difference between moral rules and conventional rules. A teacher can give permission to break a classroom rule like eating snacks. That is fine. But if a teacher says you can hurt another student, healthy children recognize that is wrong, regardless of who authorized it. The children who struggle with this distinction are those who have difficulty understanding empathy and moral reasoning. And that parallel Sam draws is absolutely devastating, because divine command theory operates on exactly that logic. When Sam points out that this framework suggests if God commands something harmful, it automatically becomes good, he is exposing the core problem with this entire approach. Morality becomes nothing more than following orders from an authority figure you cannot question. And Craig's defense is always, well, God would not command something harmful because it contradicts his nature. But how do you know God's nature is good if the only way you determine goodness is by what God commands? It is circular reasoning all the way down. There is no independent standard you can appeal to. And here is why this matters in the real world and not just in philosophy classrooms. Throughout history, people have committed serious harm while genuinely believing they were following divine instructions. That is not theoretical. Historical records are full of examples where entire communities caused tremendous suffering because they believed they had religious authorization. These were not people who thought they were doing wrong. They were people who thought they were doing sacred work. And when Craig pushes back, saying, well, that is your argument too, Sam, that God did not command it, Sam fires back instantly. If God did command it, he would be worthy of moral criticism. And that is the fundamental difference between their worldviews that everyone needs to grasp. Sam is saying there are objective standards of well-being that even a divine being would be bound by. If a being commands harm, that being deserves moral scrutiny, regardless of how much power they have. Craig is saying whatever God commands becomes good by definition. One of those positions protects against harm by grounding morality in the actual experiences of conscious beings. The other can be used to justify almost anything as long as someone claims divine authorization, and that distinction is everything. So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.